Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take those dense, often complex reports and studies and really break them down into something clear and usable for you.
That's the goal.
Today, we're tackling a really significant piece of research. It's from the Research Institute of Humanities and Social Studies in Iran, looking at decades of policies on domestic violence.
Yeah, and this wasn't just a summary. The researchers were aiming for a critical analysis. They wanted to see if the policies actually worked,
Right.
assess effectiveness, figure out why things failed if they did, and then, importantly, suggest some real solutions.
And while the headline finding from the source, it kind of hits you straight away. Despite all these years of programs and laws, domestic violence, or DV, has actually been trending upwards in Iran over the last couple of decades,
Yeah.
which basically screams that the existing policies just aren't cutting it. They're not effective.
It points to a systemic issue, really. The system's running, policies exist, but they aren't actually reducing the abuse itself.
Okay, so let's try and map this out. Before we get into why it's failing, what exactly was this system? What was attempted? The source suggests it wasn't one clear strategy, right? More like bits and pieces.
Exactly. Fragmented is a good word for it. You had older general laws and then later these more specialized initiatives, but often they felt like reactions to crises rather than a planned, comprehensive approach.
So looking back at the older laws, say from the 70s or the 90s.
Yeah, you can really see the gaps there. Take the 1353 Family Protection Law. The term domestic violence, it's not even in there.
Really? So how do they talk about it?
It was framed as misconduct,
Yeah.
very vague. And mostly, it was only relevant as a potential reason for divorce, mentioned in Article 8, Clause 4.
So it wasn't treated like a crime against the person, more like a problem with the marriage itself?
Precisely. That's a good way to put it. And then the penal codes that came later, the 1370 and 1392 versions, they kind of continue that pattern. Well, DV only gets recognized if it fits into existing general criminal boxes. Things like assault and battery, insult, maybe even murder in the extreme cases.
So like a fight between strangers on the street. No recognition of the power dynamics within a family.
None at all. It completely misses that specific context of ongoing control and abuse within a family structure.
And this lack of specific recognition leads to some, well, frankly, disturbing gaps, especially for children. The report highlights Article 301 of the Penal Code. Let's talk about that.
Right, Article 301, this is often called the child murder exemption. And it's quite chilling when you look at the detail.
What does it actually say?
The law explicitly states that fathers or paternal grandfathers who kill their own child are exempt from qisas.
Okay, wait. Let's pause there. Key says that's the Islamic legal principle of retaliation, right? Sort of an eye for an eye, especially in murder cases.
Exactly. It's about equivalent justice. But under Article 301, if the father or paternal grandfather is the perpetrator, they are specifically shielded from that form of justice.
Why? What's the justification?
It stems from a legal tradition that views the father as having a kind of ownership or absolute authority over the child. So instead of qisas, they face tazir.
And Tazir is?
Tazir is a discretionary punishment decided by a judge. It usually involves imprisonment and paying daya, which is like blood money.
So effectively, it downgrades the killing of one's own child.
Right.
It's not murder requiring equal justice, but something lesser.
Yes, it frames it more like manslaughter, or maybe even just the disturbance of public order. It reinforces that patriarchal authority over the child's fundamental right to life. It's a profound legal statement.
That is staggering. Okay, so moving forward in time, after the 2000s, there were efforts to maybe improve things, right? To build more specific support.
Yes, definitely. There was a shift towards creating actual services. You saw the launch of the emergency social services, the 123 number. That was for immediate help in high-risk situations like child abuse or spousal abuse emergencies.
Like hotline.
Pretty much. And then later, around 2014, came the directive for safe houses. These were meant to provide temporary shelter, but also wraparound support, psychological help, legal advice, social assistance for women facing violence, and their children too.
And was there an attempt to fix the actual definition of DV in law?
There was. The big attempt was the Leah, which translates to a draft law or bill specifically on women's security.
Yeah.
This was meant to finally define and criminalize domestic violence properly.
But?
But as the source notes, it was unstable. It went through huge changes. The title itself changed, started as security around 2017, then shifted focus. It got tangled up in policy debates and struggled to become fully effective law. It really shows how hard it was to get consensus on a comprehensive approach.
Okay, so we have this patchwork. Old laws with major gaps, these really shocking exemptions like Article 301, and then these later attempts to build services and maybe fix the definitions. Did any of it actually work? The research looked at this, right? Comparing surveys.
Yes, they compared two big national surveys on domestic violence. One from 1383, which is about 2004, and another from 1397, around 2018. This gave them a baseline and a follow-up to measure impact.
And the result?
Well, the headline is failure, again. But the details in the data are really revealing. The overall number of women experiencing some form of DV didn't change much statistically between the two surveys. It was high in both.
So no improvement overall.
Not on the total prevalence. But what did change dramatically was the type of violence being reported. It suggests the system's failures didn't stop abuse, but maybe shifted it.
Shifted it how?
The policies, maybe unintentionally, seem to have pushed the abuse towards non-physical forms. While all these initiatives were supposedly rolling out, the rates of psychological, economic, and sexual violence just exploded.
Okay, let's break down those numbers because they really paint a picture of the system's blind spots. What were the increases?
Right, between 2004 and 2018, first, psychological and verbal violence. It went from affecting 53% of women surveyed to 60%. That's a noticeable jump, about 15% growth.
Okay, still very high.
Very high. Then, economic violence, things like controlling money, preventing someone from working, that went from 15% prevalence up to 34%.
Wow, 15 to 34. That's more than doubled.
It's a 126% increase. Huge. And then sexual violence within marriage, that saw the most dramatic rise. It jumped from 10% in 2004 to 26% in 2018.
10 to 26%. That's a 160% increase.
Exactly. A 160% growth rate in just 14 years.
While policies were supposedly addressing DV, that's more than just a shift. It feels like an indictment of where the legal focus was, doesn't it?
It strongly implies that. If the laws and enforcement mostly target physical assault, which carries the clearest, most established penalties, then maybe abusers adapted.
They moved to tactics the law wasn't properly addressing.
That seems to be the pattern. They exploited the gaps. Financial control, emotional abuse, sexual coercion, these were areas where the legal system offered less clear recourse, or maybe none at all. And the data shows abuse surging into those areas. Abusers leverage those structural weaknesses.
So the data really confirms the assessment of failure. And the source mentions other surveys backing this up too.
Yes, general public surveys from different cities also show these trends rising, adding weight to the conclusion that the policies just weren't achieving their intended goals. So why did it fail so badly? The report dug into this, identifying, believe it or not, 75 distinct causes. They grouped them into 5 main buckets: resources, policymakers, the policies themselves, implementation, and participation.
75 causes. Okay, that's a lot. Let's focus on the big structural ones the report emphasizes. You mentioned an ideological drift.
Yes, issue A, ideological drift.
Yeah.
The researchers identified this tension between what they call the aspirational axis and the consensus axis in policymaking.
Okay, aspirational axis. What does that mean in practice? Sounds a bit academic.
Think of it like this. The aspirational axis is about making policy based on an ideal, maybe even an ideological vision of what the family should be. Perfect unity, traditional roles, that sort of thing.
Right, versus
the consensus axis, which is about basing policy on reality, on evidence, on how families actually function, including the difficult parts like violence and dysfunction. The report argues that Iranian policymakers leaned heavily on the aspirational.
So they were designing policies for a perfect family that doesn't really exist, instead of dealing with the messy reality, focusing on preserving the image of family unity.
Exactly. This creates what the report calls the gap between the policymaker's issue and the society's issue. Policymakers are focused on their idealized model, perhaps ignoring how society is changing, the real stresses families are under, the actual prevalence of abuse.
And the consequence of that focus.
It leads to a defensive approach, because acknowledging the deep systemic nature of abuse might challenge that idealized family image. The policies tend to become reactive, focusing on managing the fallout like emergency shelters, rather than prevention or tackling the root causes in law and culture. It's more palliative care than systemic treatment.
That makes sense. A powerful structural bias. Okay, issue B was about the legal system itself. Chaos and fragmentation.
Yes, what they term legal inflation and fragmentation. Basically, too many laws, scattered across different codes, sometimes vague, sometimes even contradictory. A key problem here is the exhortatory nature of some laws.
Exhortatory.
Meaning
Meaning.
they encourage or advise good behavior, but lack teeth. The example given is Civil Code Article 1102. It says spouses should have good relations. Sounds nice, right?
Sure, but
But there's no criminal penalty attached if they don't. There's no enforcement mechanism. So if you're a victim trying to use that law in court for protection,
it's basically useless, just a suggestion.
pretty much, it's a moral guideline with no legal force in a criminal context. And layered on top of that is the lack of clear differentiation we talked about earlier. Policies still struggle to define DV crimes distinctly from general assault or insult.
Forcing victims into those inadequate general categories.
Right, which fails to capture the pattern of control and abuse. And of course, this ties into the neglect of non-physical abuse, the very types that the data showed were skyrocketing.
And the final big structural issue. Issue C, implementation weakness. Even if a law exists.
It might just sit there, be dormant, as the report puts it. Many laws, even parts of the family support law, apparently lack clear procedures for how they should be executed, who's responsible, what the budget is. They exist on paper, but they can't be put into action.
And even when the system does act, there's another problem.
Yes, a critical one. Prioritizing reconciliation over safety. This came up particularly in the context of court-mandated counseling, like at the Quads Judicial Centers or other family intervention programs.
How does that work against safety?
Well, the primary goal often becomes keeping the family together, achieving reconciliation and peace, which sounds positive, but in an abusive context.
You risk sending the victim right back into the danger zone.
Precisely. The system ends up prioritizing the appearance of family stability over the actual immediate physical and emotional safety of the people involved.
Okay, this next part from the source really highlights how narrow the focus has been. The report found that most policies and services seem designed primarily for one type of victim: women abused by their husbands. Is that right?
That's a major finding, yes. The design implicitly and sometimes explicitly excludes other vulnerable family members.
So who gets left out?
Well, the list reveals the blind spots inherent in that narrow marital focus. First, children.
Even though they might be in the safe houses with their mothers.
They might benefit incidentally, yes. But the report argues they lack their own explicit comprehensive legal protection against parental abuse and neglect. The idea of child welfare often takes a backseat to parental rights, especially paternal rights, in legal thinking. And that's powerfully underlined by that Article 301 exemption we discussed.
Right, the murder exemption. Okay, who else is missed?
Second, seniors. Elder abuse within the family. It's almost entirely absent from the main laws and the social support systems.
So safe houses aren't for abused elderly parents, for instance.
Generally not. The structures aren't designed for them. Their vulnerability as a distinct category of domestic violence victims just isn't really recognized or addressed in the policy framework described.
That's a huge gap. And the third group mentioned really speaks to the underlying assumptions, doesn't it?
It does. The third neglected group is male victims. The entire system, according to the analysis, seems built on this rigid model. Man as perpetrator, woman as victim.
So if a man is experiencing violence from a partner, maybe psychological, economic, even physical.
The system basically overlooks it. There aren't really support structures designed for male victims. Reporting it carries immense social stigma, and they'd likely face institutional disbelief or just a lack of available resources tailored to them.
So the picture that emerges is policymakers designing for a very specific, maybe outdated scenario. A woman physically assaulted by her husband, and in doing so, they miss the reality of all these other forms of violence, the non-physical abuse that's rising, and entire groups like kids, seniors, and men who are also victims.
That's the core critique, yes. The policies ended up being reactive, fragmented, shaped by that idealized view of the family, and ultimately just incapable of dealing with the complex, shifting, and frankly worsening reality of domestic abuse revealed by their own national surveys. #outro.
Well, that really brings our deep dive to a close, and it's quite a sobering picture. We've seen how policies meant to stop domestic violence in Iran were found to be largely ineffective. In fact, non-physical forms like sexual and economic abuse dramatically increased during the period these policies were active.
Yeah.
And the research traces this failure back to, well, institutional chaos, that ideological bias prioritizing the idea of family over actual safety, and these really fundamental legal weaknesses, dormant laws, vague definitions, lack of enforcement.
And what's really striking, I think, is that the report suggests the core failure wasn't just about, say, not having enough money or resources. It was more fundamental. It was about policymakers consistently choosing that abstract, idealized vision of family unity, that aspirational access over the concrete, immediate needs for safety, for autonomy, for the basic rights of the real people, the vulnerable members within those families.
Preserving an image, almost, at the expense of people's lives and well-being.
It seems that way. Legislating for an ideal rather than addressing the reality.
That's a powerful final thought on the potential dangers of policy driven by ideology instead of evidence. Thank you for unpacking that research with us.
My pleasure.
And for you, listening, maybe the takeaway challenge is to think about this globally. How well do our own social safety nets, wherever we are, actually measure their success? Is it based on real, measurable outcomes for people, independently verified? Or is it sometimes just based on good intentions and hopeful claims? Something to think about. We'll leave it there for this deep dive.